What would you think if you were walking in a field and you noticed two very young children speaking a language you did not recognize, wearing clothes made from material completely foreign to you, and you noticed their skin was green? Hey guys, welcome back to Supernatural Saturday. I'm Coco, and every Saturday I sit down and talk about some kind of paranormal or haunted location or an unexplained event. And today we are leaning more on the latter with the story of the Green Children of Woolpit. This is a real historical account that takes place sometime between the reign of King Stephen and King Henry II, putting the story between 1135 and 1189. And it also takes place in the little city of Woolpit, well, I wouldn't say city, village at the time of Woolpit that was in Suffolk, England. Now, during harvest season, the villagers were out sowing their fields when somebody noticed a pair of young children, a boy and a girl, standing next to a pit on the edge of the field. Now, these pits are why the town is called Woolpit. They were pits dug for wolves to keep them out of the town. Now, this man walks up to these children and notices that they're speaking a language he doesn't recognize. He doesn't recognize their clothing, and their skin is green. Now the villagers take these children to kind of the big man on campus. His name was Sir Richard de Calne of Wilkes, and he was just the rich guy in the area, and they thought he would know what to do. He would be able to house the children and feed them. So they bring the children to him, and they notice the kids seem very, very hungry, like they haven't eaten in a long time. So they try and give the kids food to eat, and the kids just seem very confused by the food that is set in front of them, and they will not touch it. They will not eat it. This goes on for days where they're not eating anything that these villagers put out for them, until one day a servant is walking through the room that the children are in, carrying a basket of raw beans. Now this beans, I saw a couple of different accounts. The only thing I can tell you is they were raw beans that were green in color. Some state they were green beans, some state they were a different kind of bean, but they were green in color and they were beans. And the children went wild. They immediately ran over and just started devouring these beans completely raw. And at least they were eating, right? So they maintained that diet for a while until they finally were convinced that the other food that was handed to them was actual food and they could eat it. But they did live off of these green colored beans for many months. It took a long time to convince them that these other things were also food. During this time, they also began teaching the children English, and they ended up getting baptized. But shortly after getting baptized, the boy, who seemed to be younger than the little girl, ended up getting very, very ill, and he ended up passing away. But the sister stayed healthy and strong, and she eventually went on to slowly start losing that green tint in her skin. She went on to marry a young man at King's Lynn in Norfolk, which was only 40 miles from where they were found at Woolpit. And some accounts say that she ended up taking the name of Agnes Barr and that her husband was an ambassador to King Henry II, but this was not verified. It's just a part of a story someone else had written that's not a verified source, so I'm not sure if that is true, but I will present it to you anyway. Now, once this girl learned English well enough, she began explaining where her and her brother had come from. Now keep in mind, they were very young when they were found, so she wouldn't have very many memories of where she came from. And in addition to that, it had been many years from the time they were found to when she is recounting these events to the villagers. She states that they came from the land of Saint Martin, where it was perpetual twilight. She said that the sky was always in the state right before the sun rises or right before the sun completely sets. She also said everything in her land was green, from the foods to the plants to the people to the animals. Everything was green in color there. And she also states that there is a luminous city across a river that they could see, but they could never go to. Now, there's a couple of different accounts of how her and her brother ended up getting to Woolpit. The first account is her and her brother were watching their father's cattle when they ended up stumbling across a cave. They ended up wandering into the cave and it got dark, they got turned around, and they started hearing a bell chiming. So they decided to follow the bell chime, where they came out of the cave at the end, and it was so bright, a bright light that they had never seen before, just so stunning and confusing. They started wandering and eventually ended up next to the pit where the villagers found them. The other account is they were tending to their father's cattle, and all of a sudden they heard a very loud noise, and then they were suddenly standing at the edge of this pit. She later states that this loud noise that they did not recognize at the time ended up being the bells chiming in the neighboring town. Obviously, there's quite a few theories on where these children came from. The one that's generally accepted by historians is they think that they were just Flemish orphans and they had come from Fornham St. Martin. And remember, she said that she came from the land of St. Martin. That land was only separated by Woolpit by the River Lark. Remember the luminous city across the river? Now, unfortunately, when Flemish immigrants came to England, to this area in the 12th century, they were heavily persecuted by King Henry II. And in 1173, there was actually quite the massacre that happened where people were killing these Flemish immigrants. At this massacre at Bury St. Edmunds, there were also frequent bell chimes, which would kind of explain them following a bell noise through the cave because they recognized it from their home. And there's a theory that the survivors of this massacre fled into the nearby forest called the Thetford Forest, and that would also kind of explain the perpetual twilight to a young child not understanding what just happened and not fully processing the massacre that they just witnessed. The trees, the canopy above, may form what they think to be kind of a twilighty night sky. Now, in this forest, there were many, many underground mines and caves, and it is theorized that the children wandered into a cave one day, not realizing they were about to get lost, and came out on the other side, wandered around for a bit, and ended up at Woolpit, where the villagers found them. Now, obviously, the villagers may not recognize the clothing that the kids were wearing or the language they were just speaking, Flemish. That explains that aspect. But Sir Richard de Calne of Wilkes definitely should have recognized that as Flemish clothing and speaking a Flemish language. He was a very well-educated man, very well-traveled, and the Flemish immigrants weren't very far from Woolpit, just across a river. So he should have recognized that, or at least had kind of an inkling, but there's no account of him ever saying they're Flemish or they're Flemish immigrants or they might be orphans. There's no account of that. There's also a couple of theories on why they have green tinted skin that's more medically accurate and not the wild theory we're going to get into in a second. But the first theory is that the children were poisoned with arsenic and left to die on the Norfolk-Suffolk border in the forest. And it is said that they were possibly poisoned by a caretaker or a parent to maybe take the money that was going to be left to them by parents or something. They're not exactly sure why they would have been poisoned, but arsenic poisoning does lead a greenish tint to the skin that would dissipate over time if they were treated well enough. It also explains why the little boy would just slowly keep getting sicker and sicker and sicker and die, and he was so young and smaller than his sister that the amount would have affected him more. There is obviously another theory that the children only simply had hyperchromatic anemia, also called chlorosis or the green sickness. Now, this is an iron deficiency that is brought about by not having a diverse enough diet. Obviously, the children were not exposed to a wide amount and variety of foods, seeing as they were only eating the raw beans straight out of the basket. So It's an iron deficiency that leads to discoloration of red blood cells in the body and leads to a greenish color of the skin. I'm gonna see if I can find a photo of that to put that up. It's kind of wild. They do have very, very green skin, and it would explain it from a more scientific standpoint. But let's get into the fun theory, aliens. I love that guy, his hair, oh my gosh. Okay, so obviously you knew we were gonna end up at this point. Children speaking a weird language with weird clothes, green skin, aliens. So there is a theory that the children's home planet is stuck in a synchronous orbit around their sun, just like our moon is stuck in that around the Earth, where one side faces the Earth always. It never rotates away from us. It's always facing us perfectly in the same position. That's the theory, that their planet is always one side is facing their sun. Now obviously that would only make a very small habitable zone for any kind of creatures that kind of live like us that would survive in our planet. I feel crazy talking about aliens, but it's so much fun. So the very small habitable zone would be a perpetual twilight. On one side they have the sun and it's completely uninhabitable. That side would be scorching hot. Everything would be dead and burning on that side. Whereas the other dark side would be freezingly cold. Everything would be frozen. Nothing could survive. So they're left with this small zone of perpetual twilight. And that would explain the twilight theory and why they had green skin and they were surviving off of green colored foods from their alien planet. This is wild, but fun. So the theory is that it was either an accident or the children were sent here on purpose by a matter compressor that either malfunctioned or functioned perfectly, sending the children here. And it was either an accident, like I said, or it was on purpose to save the children. Maybe the planet was dying, maybe there weren't enough resources, and they found Earth and realized that their kind could survive here, and they sent these two children to live among us. Now that is a wild theory. What do y'all think? Do you believe in aliens? Or do you think it was just a simple case of anemia or arsenic poisoning? Let me know in the comments. I look forward to reading through your theories, and I hope to see you next week for another Supernatural Saturday. See you then.